heading kind of into that definitely winter time where we'll be doing these on a more regular basis than we seem to do them over the summer. But we will continue into next year. That's our intent. As Marnie and I always say, if you've got ideas for topics that you'd like to hear more about, please let us know. I think we've got some great ones coming up, and especially today's should be a good one for a lot of us who are woodland owners and need to know more. So I want to make certain that everybody realizes we do have ISA credits for today, and we do have SAF credits for today. And so at the end of the session, I will post the link in the chat box for you to click on and put your information into the survey, and then I will share those with National. Just kind of a quick, if you haven't been with us before, my name is Kathy Smith. I'm our Extension Program Director in Forestry and one of the folks who oversee the Ohio Woodland Stewards Program. Marnie Tichenell is here with us today as well. Marnie is our wildlife person and also in charge of some of the woodland steward stuff. But I wanted to give you kind of this, here's a short list of what's coming up. There's plenty more things on our website. I did add yesterday the save the date for our annual Ohio Woodland Water and Wildlife Conference, and I added a save the date for our Ohio River Valley Woodland and Wildlife Workshop, both of those being in March. But you can kind of see where we are here through the month of December. And this is the ad for the December webinar on non-native invasive forest pests and sentinels. It's a fascinating look at how they're trying to predict some of our issues that we could have with some non-native invasive pests from other parts of the world. So hopefully you'll join us for that one as well. All of these webinars get posted, recorded, and posted on our woodlandstewards.osu.edu and under the resources tab. And then to the side, there's a webinar link that you can click, and they're all listed there. And last but not least, you'll see on here, I have Ohio Maple Days. If you are a maple producer or interested in becoming a maple producer, December 10th is a date for you. Join us in Ashland at Ashland University for our annual Ohio Maple Days event, where we'll talk a lot of different things maple and have a bunch of vendors that you can talk to about equipment and other things that go into having a sugar bush, if that's something that you think you might want to do, even on the scale of just a couple of trees in your backyard, to you know, something larger if you've got a larger wooded acreage. So as we get started for today, we ask that you put your questions in the Q&A box, and we will kind of monitor those. We don't monitor the chat quite as closely. I try to keep an eye on the Q&A, and we will deal with the questions once Tom is done with his session today. So lots of good questions, post them in the Q&A. Like, you guys are always really good at good questions. I think all of our speakers have said that the questions can be a little challenging at times, which is okay. That's what we're here for. So without further ado, today we're going to talk about forest carbon markets and what landowners need to know. Tom Rooney, see, I need some sleep still, Tom, is with the Nature Conservancy, and they're talking about their rollout of a program here in Ohio for Ohio woodland owners. And I know we've had other carbon and climate talks as part of our webinar series. And, you know, the whole, you know, what do I do? How do I get involved? That's always been kind of that, what's the next step? And there's always been kind of some, well, you can kind of do this, you can kind of do that. So I'm excited to hear Tom's presentation, and hopefully it answers all of your questions that you have. So with that, I will stop sharing and leave it to you, Tom. Welcome.
Thank you. All right, Everyone can see my screen?
Mhm.
All right, excellent. So Kathy, Marty, thanks so much for inviting me today. And I'm happy to share what little I know about forest carbon and forest carbon markets. This is a relatively new area for me. I've been working in this area for just under 2 years, and recently left a job as a university professor to try to focus a little bit more on sound forest stewardship and how forests can be used in climate change. It was sort of my midlife career shift here. So I've been neck deep in forest carbon markets over the past 2 years. And I can share with you what I know, but please don't look to me as the great expert on all things forest carbon. I'm just doing my best here and sharing what I can. All right. And my screen is not advancing. There we go. So in terms of an overview for today, first, I'd like to sort of drive home the point that forest stewardship really can significantly slow climate change. And in fact, it's probably the best and most immediate tool we have in our climate change toolbox to effectively slow the rate of climate change. That may change 20 years from now, but for right now, forests are absolutely critical in addressing these broader climate questions. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of how one gets paid for carbon. I'm going to talk about a program that the Nature Conservancy, in conjunction with the American Forest Foundation, are rolling out in Ohio early next year, called the Family Forest Carbon Program. This is a program that is already in a few states right now. It's been in Pennsylvania for several years. It's recently come to West Virginia, Western Maryland. It's now rolling out in parts of the northeastern U.S. And hopefully here very soon. And last, and I think probably most important for everyone out there, is I have a number of questions that you as a landowner will want to ask before signing any forest carbon contract. There's again a lot to consider, and because forest carbon is sort of a relatively new market, there's a lot of things out there that might not immediately occur to you that you find out a year or two down the road turned out to be important. So I'm going to go relatively slowly through those questions because I think it's really worth sort of jotting them down as we go if you're thinking about participating in forest carbon markets. So first and foremost, I wanted to start off with some good news here. Carbon emissions have been falling in the United States, and they've been falling for over 20 years. Our economy has continued to grow over the last 2 decades, but basically the carbon intensity of our economy has dropped significantly from early 2000s, looking at nearly 6 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide produced. We've sort of dropped down to about by 5,000. So that's, nearly a 20% drop over that decade. And nobody's had to give up their cars or turn off their heat in the winter or anything like that to achieve that. And I suspect that this trend of falling carbon emissions is going to continue, even independent of recent legislation passed in the last year or so that I think is going to start to really accelerate this decline. I wish I could say that this was the trend globally. Unfortunately, it's not. But a number of nations, not just the U.S., are also experiencing this drop in carbon emissions, at least at the national level. So there is good news out there. Now, another bit of good news is that our forests and good sound management of forests can actually contribute to stabilizing climate warming. So here's this is sort of a noisy graph. If you look, we've got time down across the horizontal axis across the bottom. We have global carbon emissions on that vertical line, and we see basically since the year 2000. Emissions have steadily crept up globally, despite what's happening at the US. And if we continue sort of on that historic emissions trajectory, we'd expect that global emissions would continue to increase year after year after year. And that's sort of that black line labeled business as usual emissions. What we are seeing presently is a number of policies in place to try to mitigate fossil fuels, to try to sort of bend that line down, which is labeled here as fossil fuel mitigation. That's been, not hugely successful globally, but we are seeing places like in the United States where that is actually working, that fossil fuel mitigation is starting to bend down. Now, if we add to that the contributions of forests and other types of what are called natural climate solutions, basically harnessing the power of nature to accelerate carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere, that can actually buy us a little bit more time or a little bit more flexibility in terms of the rate of switching from fossil fuels to non-carbon based fuels powering our world. So ultimately, that natural climate solutions mitigation pathway is really sort of giving us up to about 37% flexibility in that fossil fuel mitigation. So this is using nature is really sort of reducing the pain, either in terms of cost or in terms of time of switching away from carbon-based fuels, driving the economy to non-carbon-based sources. Okay, so nature is a good thing in ways that we had not even anticipated a few decades ago. Looking at carbon in forests, I'd like to, just sort of think about, we know that trees breathe in carbon dioxide, they exhale oxygen, which is just absolutely wonderful. And as trees grow and get larger, they store increasing amounts of carbon per year. So if we look at sort of down in the bottom left-hand side of this graph, we're looking at these trees, a tree with a 10-inch diameter. This is a sugar maple in this case. 10-inch diameter tree has nearly 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent or carbon stored in its branches, in its roots, in its trunk. And as that tree grows, if you go from a 10-inch to a 20-inch, basically sort of doubling the size, the carbon stored doesn't double. The carbon stored actually increases by more than a factor of 4. So we have 4 tons, 4.1 tons stored in a tree of 20 inches in diameter. And again, as we go from 20 to 40, we don't go up to 8 tons stored. We're now looking at 21, almost 22 tons of carbon stored in that 40-inch diameter tree. And of course, this sort of makes sense because as trees grow, diameter is sort of a little bit misleading in terms of the overall volume of that tree, because if you remember way back to geometry, it's that radius squared times the circumference. And as that radius gets bigger and bigger, you have an exponential increase in the size of that tree. So this graph sort of on the top left-hand side is showing that, basically the carbon storage of trees is actually exponential. And so as those trees get larger and larger, they're storing exponentially more carbon in their physical bodies. And so looking over at sort of the right-hand side, this graph here, and I promise I'm not going to have a lot of graphs in this talk. We're about done with the graphs for the most part. Again, we're looking at stand age in years on the horizontal, the vertical axis across the bottom, and then on the vertical axis, carbon storage. Essentially, as forests grow older, as a particular stand grows older, the amount of carbon stored per acre ends up just continuing to increase and increase asymptotically. So as your forests get older, they're effectively storing much more carbon. So folks are thinking, well, we've got these forests. Are there things we can do in terms of forest management to help us store more carbon on the landscape and help slow carbon dioxide? And I think that was sort of the genesis of forest carbon markets here in the United States, but also globally. Now, in terms of the potential, this is from a study that was done, I believe, in 2017, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. There is a lot of additional potential for climate mitigation And this is sort of scaled to what we're looking to the year 2025, and it's looking at billions of tons of carbon dioxide per year stored. And sort of across the top here, we're looking at reforestation, basically putting trees to where they aren't right now. That gives us the absolute biggest bang for climate mitigation potential. And you'll notice that these colors are, we have sort of a light green, a medium green, and a dark green. A light green color indicates that this is something that's cost competitive right now. Sort of that medium color green indicates something that is going to be expected to be cost competitive by 2025. And then that dark green is cost prohibitive, and may remain so sort of going forward. So actually looking at sort of these different strategies, from reforestation to urban reforestation to fire management, blue plantations. One that sort of really jumps out here in terms of most cost effective, both now and in the near future, is natural forest management, effectively managing the forests that we do have in ways that are going to help accelerate carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere. So a lot of carbon projects out there that are going to be available in Ohio are sort of within this sphere of natural forest management. Just as an aside, this is your random fact of the day. In terms of carbon markets out there, forests make up only a small fraction of carbon markets. There are about 171 different pathways for carbon mitigation. There are just a handful within forests, and natural forest management is one of the major carbon markets out there now, and it's expected to remain so over the next decade or so. So natural forest management is what we'll be sort of focused on today going forward. So there are some things that sort of, that make sense. If you're going to be selling timber, we sort of know how that happens. There's a logger who's going to pay you for that timber. Specifically, they're going to be paying you to harvest and remove trees from your property, and those trees end up going to a mill and end up getting processed into various forest products. Now, what's the analog here with forest carbon? Okay, so you're not going to be going to a logger. You're going to be going instead to someone who's called a project developer, specifically a carbon project developer. And that can include ourselves, the Nature Conservancy, in partnership with the American Forest Foundation. There are other carbon project developers out there as well. NCX, the Natural Climate Exchange, has been involved in Ohio in the past few years. Core Carbon is another project developer that is expected to launch in Ohio over the next year or so. Forest Carbon Works is another. They're also currently active in Ohio. These are sort of the major players right now. There may be others, but I think these are sort of the big four nationally. And instead of, these project developers aren't going to come in and harvest your trees and send them off to a mill. What they're going to do is enter into a contract with you, the landowner, that's going to require adjusting or limiting the amount of timber harvesting, with an eye towards increasing carbon storage. That carbon is going to end up being verified by a third party, and you'll be generating, instead of board feet, you'll be generating tons of carbon represented as carbon credits that will go to some end buyer. A little bit more on that in a minute. Towards the end of the presentation today, I'll give you just some contact information for both for our carbon program at the Nature Conservancy. I'll also give you contact information for NCX, Core Carbon, and Forest Carbon Works. There are a number of organizations out there right now that are committed to what they're calling net zero emissions. There are nations right now that have national goals and national commitments to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Also, about 20% of the world's largest 2,000 corporations are also committed to net zero by the year 2050 or before. So what does net zero mean? Well, ultimately, this means that they want to have no net carbon emissions in the course of producing the products and services that they provide. And the way they can do this, there's really sort of three ways. First and foremost is they can reduce the overall amount of energy inputs going into the production of their products and services. So overall increases in energy efficiency. Secondly, they can switch sourcing from carbon-based to non-carbon-based energy sources, whether that's through local generation with solar, or otherwise sourcing energy that is not carbon-based. And then third and finally, for those emissions that are especially difficult to eliminate, what they're doing is they're looking to purchase carbon credits to sort of get rid of that remaining 5% or 10% that they cannot get rid of via energy efficiency or decarbonization of their product or service production. Now, the way these would work is, this is basically effectively a partnership between a company, which we have over here on the right-hand side of our figure, and a forest owner over on the left-hand side. So what happens is we have a company that is trying to reduce their greenhouse emissions, but not quite getting there. And what they need to do is ensure that for every ton of carbon that they're producing, that extra ton is going to be offset somewhere else through carbon markets. So with forest carbon markets, what these companies will do is they will pay forest landowners to store that extra carbon in their forests. Those forest landowners, with the assistance of a carbon project developer, will be able to issue what's called a carbon offset. These are typically denominated in units of 1 ton of carbon, much the same way our currency is denominated in US dollars. These carbon offsets are then verified and sold to those companies that can then claim that what emissions they are still producing are being offset through a verified process that forest landowners have helped them achieve. So this is sort of the big picture of how it works. So money flows to the landowner, and the carbon offset credit flows back to the company. To sort of give you a look under the hood of how one of these carbon project developers works, I'm going to talk a little bit at our program that the Nature Conservancy has with the American Forest Foundation, which we're calling the Family Forest Carbon Program. Our goals, I think, are sort of a little bit different than most other carbon project developers out there. This is a new carbon program that is really just focused on supporting family forest owners. And our goal is to help those family forest owners improve forest health and address climate change, and effectively help those owners access carbon markets. Because really, until this point, there have been major barriers to market access. If you were to look at all of the various forest carbon projects out there, the vast majority, over 90% of them, are being done on properties 5,000 acres or larger. And I don't know who's on this call, but if I was a betting man, I would suggest that there's not a single person out there with 5,000 acres. Most family forest owners are 1,000 acres or less, well below 1,000 acres for most private landowners in Ohio. And properties of less than 1,000 acres account for less than 1% of forest carbon projects. And there's a reason for this. Forest carbon projects are actually pretty complex. There's a high cost to participate. And for those 5,000 plus acre projects out there, they involve very long contracts, typically 100 years or more. So these are significant barriers that we think our program really sort of helps overcome. So the elevator pitch, the short version of the way our program works, is that we work with landowners over the time frame of 20 years. A landowner would sign a 20-year contract, and they would receive payment. We're still working out the exact payment for Ohio, but it's going to be ballpark of about $200 per acre. And in exchange for receiving $200 per acre, the landowner would sign over the carbon ownership to the project developer for that 20-year period. So the landowner is going to receive payments even if carbon market prices decline in the future. We're currently in the process of revising contracts to allow for some profit sharing if carbon market prices actually increase. But again, our program is relatively new and still evolving, and we're sort of learning as we go in this new marketplace. So in addition to payment, what else do we provide for landowners? The first and foremost, we provide actual support. We're going to connect various landowners with natural resources professionals who can provide technical assistance through site visits, through the development or revision of forest management plans. If you don't have a forest management plan, we can work with you to develop one. If you have a forest management plan, we can work with you to put an addendum on that plan to enable you to enroll in this forest carbon program. We can also connect you with other types of services, such as contractors that can do timber stand improvement work or invasive species control, what have you, to help you meet your particular objectives for your property. And then, the other big piece that we're sort of really focused on is sustainability, making sure that the project that we're developing is not just generating carbon for some faraway buyer, but it's it's providing multiple benefits that a landowner might be interested in, including timber production and enhancement of wildlife habitat, protecting water resources or other special places on your property, to ensure that those remain protected, to ensure that any timber produced is being done so in a smart and sustainable way. So in terms of the management requirements our program has, we do allow limited harvesting or some thinning within sustainable guidelines. I'll get to a little bit more specific on that in a minute. But the main focus is we really want to focus on allowing the forest stand to mature, mainly through retaining some of the highest quality trees on the site. And our goal, our twin goals with AFF and Nature Conservancy are really to help landowners develop a more valuable timber stand and improved habitats for wildlife, improve water quality over sort of this 20-year interval. And in terms of some of the specifics, yes, timber can be harvested, but no more than a quarter of the property spatial area can be removed over this 20-year period. Likewise, you can't have a reduction of more than 10% in the average stand diameter. Again, so this sort of speaks to helping the forest develop and store carbon in some of those larger canopy trees. And then we also have some water protections. We need a 50-foot buffer zone around any water bodies. This is pretty consistent with our best management practices that we have in Ohio for protecting water quality. So in terms of technical support from forest professionals, we have a network of foresters already here in Ohio that we're sort of educating about this particular program. And we've worked elsewhere. We know that this family forest carbon program is compatible with the Ohio, with EQIP. It's compatible with Ohio Tree Farm. It's also compatible with Ohio Forest Tax Law and with CIUV. That said, our particular program is not going to be right for every landowner out there. Again, because we do have some restrictions on the amount of timber that can be harvested, and it is a 20-year contract, so it's not right for everybody. But we do think it is a pretty compelling offering compared to some of the other options out there. We also provide free of cost a forest management plan if it's needed. And it's not a one size fits all. It's really going to be tailored to an individual landowner's goals, and sort of making sure that your goals as a landowner sort of mesh with the specific program requirements that we have. Folks aren't required to harvest timber. You can do entirely non-timber forest products, but if you do have an eye towards timber, we can work with that too. Again, if you're looking at improving stand qualities and stand value over time. And lastly, because we have this network of forest professionals, we're able to provide guidance on improving forest health for your property going forward. One other thing, this is of interest to some folks, but certainly not everyone who's in our program. Carbon markets themselves are relatively new and can be still a bit controversial. There was for those of you who are fans of John Oliver, he did a segment on carbon markets a few months back, saying that they're he really sort of dug into them, saying they're not valid. There's no actual benefit of these carbon markets. I think it was he got some of the facts wrong, but I think some of the facts he did get across were certainly correct. And from my perspective, as someone who's relatively new to carbon markets, again, I've only been doing this for about 2 years. I've seen that in the past, there have been cases of lax standards for carbon markets. There have been cases of outright fraud within the last, about 10 to 15 years ago, none major since. And there's still some ongoing questions with whether or not carbon markets really are going to make a significant contribution to fighting climate change. Now, the Nature Conservancy and the American Forest Foundation have strategically decided that we're not going to sell any carbon that we will not 100% stand behind as being valid, being credible, and delivering an actual real carbon benefit. We worked over the last few years to develop a new carbon accounting methodology that has been widely recognized as increasing both accuracy and credibility for carbon markets, in which we're not out there saying, well, what would have happened on this particular forest if they hadn't enrolled in the program. We're actually looking at people who are enrolled in our program versus other properties that are not enrolled, and looking over time at the difference in carbon storage on those enrolled properties versus those aren't enrolled. In a sense, it's using almost like a framework that's used in epidemiology, so a medical intervention where some properties are treated sort of by enrolling in the program. Some are not treated. They're sort of the baseline condition. And we're actually looking to see how much additional carbon we get in enrolled properties. And we're only selling that additional carbon that is above and beyond what we're seeing elsewhere on similar properties. Now, our organization and the American Forest Foundation, together, we both remain committed to continually improving this program and refining it to make sure that our carbon remains, very credible and very high quality. The other piece I think is also important is that we're only selling carbon to end users or buyers that are already reducing emissions and have credible plans to decarbonize their offering of products and services. So, for example, right now we're generating carbon credits, but we're not selling them to Shell Oil. Shell right now is not in the process of decarbonizing their products that they sell. We are, however, selling on to companies that are working on both sourcing renewable energy or non-carbon based energy, and are actually making demonstrated steps to reduce their carbon emissions year after year. If we see a company already on this pathway, we're willing to help accelerate them in terms of moving to that net zero goal that they have, because they're not just stating a goal, but they're actually putting their money where their mouth is, and they're moving towards that goal. Those are the companies that we're engaging with to help them succeed with their goals. So a little bit about how one would enroll their land in this particular program. In terms of eligibility, we're looking at properties with at least 30 or more contiguous forest acres within an eligible county in Ohio. Initially, when we roll out, we're going to be rolling out in the Appalachian Plateau region. So that is effectively going to be the the eastern part of the state. If you have hills and out your window, you're probably in the Appalachian Plateau region. We expect to be able to offer this program in early 2023. We're still putting the final touches on some of the details of payments and some final details in terms of working out just a couple other sort of minor details about like what properties are going to be eligible, which ones aren't. Forests originating from natural regeneration are going to be eligible. If you have plantations, plantation forests, plantations are not going to be eligible for the program. If you have a mix on your property, if you have some plantation land and some natural forest, if you have at least 30 plus acres of natural forest, you would be able to enroll that portion. Lastly, there can't be any legal restrictions on timber harvest activity on your property at present. And this can be in the form of local ordinances or being in some type of designated no harvest area, or if you have a conservation easement on the property that prohibits timber harvesting, you would not be eligible for enrolling in the program. And the workflow looks a little bit like this. We have a website map tool, which you can find through familyforestcarbon.org, where you'd be able to locate your property on a map. It's not unlike using Google Maps, but it shows individual parcels. So you'd be able to go in and click on your property, select that. You would then be put in touch with a representative from the American Forest Foundation to talk a little bit more about specifics. They would connect you with a forester in our network who would come out and do a visit to your property and work with you on developing or modifying a forest management plan. We'd have a contract for you to sign. We're working on streamlining it right now. It's about a 20-page contract, but the contract basically lays out the terms of signing over carbon rights to the Nature Conservancy and American Forest Foundation for that 20-year period, and indicating the sort of the terms and the schedule of payments. And you'll receive your first payment shortly thereafter, typically about 8 weeks after you sign the contract. And then you'll begin to implement a forest management plan that you've developed. So this is just roughly the sort of the process of how that takes. When we have plenty of foresters, this is typically an 8-week process from start to finish. Right now, though, getting foresters out to properties is sort of our bottleneck. As long as we have enough foresters, we can sort of hit that 8-week timeline. In other states, there are some bottlenecks with getting foresters out to properties in a timely manner. Some of the folks who have been involved for a couple of years in the program now, these are just some testimonials. As always, reader beware, but we have landowners saying things like they appreciate having the expertise and support that they needed. Another one was able to help offset some of the taxes that they'd have to pay to keep the land. Another one's just interested in being a good steward of the land, and the program sort of aligns with their goals of helping them do that. And then another couple here is showing that they have a farm and a forest. It's their business. They're seeing their trees as having asset value that's relatively brand new that can be monetized, and that's worked out great for them. So I have my contact information at the end of the presentation, but I want to let you know a little bit about some of the other carbon project developers working in Ohio. NCX has been active, I think, for the last 2 years or so, and you can find them through ncx.com. They've been attractive for a lot of landowners because they do a 1-year contract that involves agreeing to not cut your trees for a 1-year period. That's called a harvest deferral. And I believe right now NCX has a suspension on their program, and they are sort of in the process of reevaluating those carbon markets. They've sort of have had some trouble selling their carbon, and so they're sort of on a pause. That'll probably be lifted in the relatively near future. So if you're interested in these sort of short-term options, you can check out NCX. Forest Carbon Works is another, and they're at forestcarbonworks.org. Forest Carbon Works is they're sort of a hybrid organization. They're not a for-profit, and they're not a not-for-profit. They're sort of this they're a public good corporation, and they have a 40-acre minimum, and they'll engage you with a contract that runs 100 years. And they allow for some timber harvest, but there's limits on the amount of harvest that can take place. With Forest Carbon Works, you can also go through their website, and they will let you know if you can enroll or not. Sometimes a landowner has 40 or 50 or 60 acres, but for reasons related to their particular program, they let you know that they will not enroll your property, or they will. I think it's a good program. I know a lot of landowners are not interested in a 100-year contract, but I think it's a sound program as far as generating credible carbon offsets. There is another developer called Core Carbon at corecarbon.com. They're not yet enrolling in Ohio, but they should be at some point in 2023. I believe their contract is a 25-year period. They have a 40-acre minimum. And they also have at least part of it is a harvest deferral, typically for, I think, 6 to 15 years. And you can select areas of your property that you would want to enroll. If you had 400 acres, for example, you can enroll 200 of them and not enroll 200. You can sort of go through and identify individual areas that you would enroll in this particular program. It might be appealing for some landowners as well, again, but it's not yet available here in Ohio. The presentation I gave on Family Forest Carbon Program, each one of these programs also has sort of their details in terms of harvest limits and payments and all that sort of stuff that change fairly rapidly. So I try to keep abreast of roughly of what they're doing. I don't know all the specifics, but if you're interested, they're worth contacting as well. All right, so for the sort of the final part of my presentation, I'd like to get into what I think is really sort of the most important. Now you sort of have an overview roughly of sort of how carbon markets work, who's buying the carbon, what enrollment might look like for at least one particular program. There are a number of questions you're going to want to ask before signing any contract, whether it's with the Nature Conservancy or any other organization. So again, I encourage you to take notes. I think this stuff is fairly important, especially given that this is a new market, and sort of using common sense isn't necessarily going to help you because we don't have a long history of this market existing. So first question you're going to want to ask folks is, how long is the contract? I know for Nature Conservancy and American Forest Foundation, we have a 20-year contract. I've seen contracts as short as 1 year, as long as 125 years. It's really important to know how long you're going in for. Second question you're going to want to ask is, what can I do and what can't I do with my land while this contract's in place? So, the contract's going to set some parameters on that, but you might have a specific question. You might say like, hey, I've got a bunch of dead elm trees, or I'm sorry, a bunch of dead ash trees, that I'm planning on taking down in, next year. If I sign the contract now, how's that going to affect things? So those specific questions, I think are fairly important to ask before you sit down and sign. Another one is if you have questions, who do you call? Often if you're signing up through a website, it's not entirely clear, like who's going to be your point of contact over the course of the life of the contract. You want to make sure that you have that person, or at least some number that you're going to be able to get, as those questions come up over time, you need to be able to know who to call to make sure that you're agreeing to the terms of the contract. Yeah, so what happens if I sell the land or transfer the land to my heirs before the end of the contract? What then? Is that permitted? Is that not permitted? Something you'll definitely want to consider, even if you're in a relatively short-term contract of 1 year. These are important questions. Some contracts address land transfers, some don't. Some would put you in breach. So again, these are important questions to sort out before you sign. Next, make sure you know how much you're going to be paid and what that schedule of payments is going to be. I know for our program, we with the Family Forest Carbon Program, we make large payments in the first year and the last year, and smaller payments in between. We don't provide the 200 all sort of in one shot. We're making sure that you're getting money every year over that 20-year period. But every program's a little bit different in terms of how they handle that. All right, more questions. Okay, you're going to need to ask if people are going to need to come on your property. For some of these programs, the answer is yes. For others, it's no. For others, it's still maybe. If people need to come on your property, like how often, how long are they going to be there, and what are they going to be doing? These are all questions. As a landowner, you have rights to answers. You have a right to answers to these questions. I know for some other carbon projects I've been involved with, we typically have a carbon auditor come out every year. They're there for 3 or 4 days, making measurements, looking at the trees, basically doing some carbon accounting. But not every program has that. So again, find out if people are going to be on your property. Another important one: what happens if there's a catastrophic event that kills trees on your land? That's not your fault. Right now, we have a big wildfire that's almost entirely contained down in Lawrence County, over 1,000 acres in size. That's not anybody's fault, but there are some, if your forest ends up having mortality due to a fire, due to a windstorm, due to an insect outbreak, what happens? Do you still get your payments, or do you have to return payments? What happens? A really important question to ask. I know for our program, at the Family Forest Carbon Program, you're not held liable for these catastrophic events. You still receive payments, but that's not going to be the case with every program out there. A similar one: what happens if you're the victim of timber theft? Timber theft always seems to be a problem somewhere, especially with absentee landowners. What happens if you're a victim? How does that affect your contract? Are you going to be in breach, or is that going to be covered? 8, I think, is a great question. If you don't ask any of these others, definitely ask this one. It's like, what happens if your personal situation changes unexpectedly, and you need to manage your forest in a way that violates the contract? Perhaps you have an emergency. You need to convert that forest into cash. What happens then? I know for our program, we have clauses in our contract that allow you to do this with repayment of any funds that had gone your way. Not every program is going to allow you to exit the contract or breach the contract in this way. Yeah, here's another important one. What happens if the project developer goes bankrupt, or what happens if carbon markets disappear in the middle of your contract? What happens to you? again, carbon markets are still relatively new. In fact, right now we're sort of in carbon markets 2.0 in the United States. There were carbon markets sort of in the early 2000s to mid 2000s that went bust and did go away. Markets are back. There's a lot more money now going into carbon markets than 10 or 15 years ago. And it, from my perspective, it seems like they're here to stay, but who knows what the future holds. So again, ask your project developer what happens if the market goes away in the middle of your contract. Does that release you from your contract? Do you have to repay? Do you get to keep money? These are all important questions you're going to want to have answers to before signing on that dotted line. Earlier, I had mentioned, common sense not always being able to help us in navigating these new markets. And here's a great example. Ask your project developer if you enroll in this particular carbon project. Say, for example, you're enrolling in a 1-year contract with NCX to defer timber harvest. Can you decide later that you want to switch to a different carbon project? Say you've done a year with NCX and now you want to do Family Forest Carbon Program. Can you switch to that different carbon project developer? The answer is it depends. I know for Family Forest Carbon Program, if you've been involved in a carbon project before with NCX or another carbon project developer, you're not going to be eligible for our program. That might not be the case for other forest carbon projects, but the way our rules are written for our program, we can't enroll properties that have been previously enrolled in other carbon projects. You could stay with your previous carbon project developer, but you might not be able to switch to new ones. So this is something you want to talk long and hard with your carbon project developer before signing on that dotted line. And then another important question, what information, specifically what data about your land is going to become public? Okay. What's going to remain private? There are privacy concerns associated with any carbon project. Okay, so at the end of your project, what's going to happen to data that was public? And are there any steps that you can take to protect your privacy? Again, especially over the last 2 decades, we've seen, the importance of privacy concerns really, really, take off with the advent of everything from social media to smartphones, and our control over our data, seems to diminish with each passing year. Understanding how your data is going to be used, what's going to be public, what's going to be private, and what happens to that data at the end of that is public at the end of the project. These are all things I think most people would want answers to before signing any contract. All right, I think that concludes the bulk of what I was hoping to share with you today. If you have any additional questions, I'm always happy to share what I know about forest carbon markets with you. My email is tomrooney@tnc.org. I'm happy to field questions at any time. Just feel free to shoot me any questions that might occur to you later. I am currently working as the Sustainable Forestry Director, and I'm based here in Ohio. So feel free to reach out to me with any questions you have. And if you're also interested in enrolling in Family Forest Carbon Program, again, we're expecting that to be available in early 2023. I would appreciate hearing from you, and let me know. And as that program is becoming available, I'd be happy to try to get you to the front of the line so that you can be sort of in relatively early and get rolling sooner rather than later. So that concludes my presentation for today, and I am happy to take questions.
Okay, thanks, Tom. That's a great presentation, and we do have questions.
I knew it.
You knew that would happen, right? So let's start here at the top. Is the carbon you discuss, Laura wants to know, stored in trees for the above ground portion, or does it include the roots also?
That's a great question. It includes the above ground and the below ground parts, but more importantly, there's a whole other part that I think is worth talking about. Our family forest carbon program is emphasizes growing larger trees. We know those larger trees are storing more carbon, but also when those larger trees go to mills, if they're high quality trees, they're going to get processed into dimensional lumber. And products that use dimensional lumber, like furniture and framing and so forth, these are timber products that have a relatively long life. They're going to be able to store that as a forest product for several decades after it leaves the forest. Compared to some low grade timber that might go into producing wood pellets or fiberboard or what have you, which would decay more rapidly. So we're thinking both about the forest storing more carbon in the forest, but also storing more carbon if those trees then go on to become forest products later on. So yes, it's the roots. It's in fact, it's even in the soil too. So we'll look at a stand and not just focus on the trees, because there's carbon all throughout that forest.
Okay. So Leah asks, when you say storing carbon, is this over a period of time in the example you had for the maple tree graph?
Yeah. So yes, it is. As that tree grows and gets progressively bigger, that is sort of the net storage of carbon in that tree. So that big 40-inch diameter tree was storing 4.7 tons of carbon. It wasn't 4.7 tons per year. It was just 4.7 tons by the time you reach that particular size.
Okay. Laura asks, could part of the strategy for mitigation be to grow quickly growing trees?
Yes. So there's a trade-off here, right? So quickly growing trees will absorb carbon at a much higher rate than an older stand. An older stand is going to be storing carbon. Basically, the amount of carbon that's going to be present on that site is going to be significantly higher. So growing trees, yes, that is definitely part of an overall strategy, but it's also worth keeping in mind, sort of in those early stages of early succession, when the forest has been cleared, you have new trees going in. There's going to be some loss of carbon from that stand through the soils and through decaying roots. So even though those trees are taking up carbon very fast, those open stands are also emitting carbon very fast. So typically there's a period that can last, really up to about a decade or so, where even though the trees are growing quickly, that forest stand is losing carbon on a net basis. But sort of once you get through that little bottleneck, those rapidly growing trees, yes, are taking up more carbon. And so looking at forest renewal through regeneration, and also sort of that other piece I haven't talked about much, but reforestation. Both of those are also part of that carbon mitigation strategy. Great question.
Mm-hmm. Thomas asks, why would urban reforestation be cost prohibitive?
Because urban forestry is hard. Is the short answer.
And expensive.
But it's expensive. If you're an urban landowner, the cost of maintaining your trees. But also, often trees are not necessarily well cared for, especially if they're out in a median or in a we call them hell strips here in Columbus, between the road and the sidewalk. Mm-hmm. They don't always get the water they need. They don't always get the care that they need. And the mortality rates that we see in urban areas tend to be a lot higher. So we can do a lot of urban tree planting in urban areas and neighborhoods. But because of the high mortality rates, typically there's either a high maintenance cost to lower that mortality or a high replacement cost. Mm-hmm. I wish it wasn't the case. But the other piece is, trees in urban environments are also under a lot more stress than out in the forest, because they're sort of removed from that broader context of having neighbor trees, of having the natural enemies that are going to kill the caterpillars that are feeding on their leaves, and roots under concrete and asphalt, they don't like it.
Well, and they usually have shorter lifespans. I mean, so a bur oak in town doesn't usually grow for 400 years like you might find one out in the woods. So
sadly, no.
Yeah, it's a lot shorter time frame. So Anonymous asked, what does it mean to sign over carbon ownership? What does a landowner lose by doing this?
That's a great question. And thank you for asking that. So when you thinking about land ownership right now, you might own, the surface, what are called the surface rights. So you own the right to harvest timber, to build property, to run a water line in, but you might not own the subsurface rights. Those rights might be owned by a minerals company, an oil company that would be able to come in and access those mineral rights. If they would because you don't own sort of everything. Carbon rights are a little bit like that. They're sort of like those subsurface rights. You own all parts of your property, but the piece that you don't own is you would give up the right over the specified period to sell that carbon in a marketplace. Effectively, you'd be double dipping if a carbon project developer was selling that carbon and you were selling it too, right? Because there should only be one carbon credit generated and you're claiming that there's two. Mm-hmm. So signing over those rights is sort of establishing clear ownership of who owns that carbon and for what period of time.
So I have multiple questions on the $200 an acre payment. Is it a one-time payment, an annual payment? Mm-hmm. Let me see what else. Annual, let's see, and when is it paid? Those are kind of I condensed several questions there.
Yes, and the first thing I'm going to say is, elsewhere where the program has rolled out, we've seen payments of anywhere from about $160 to $300 per acre. So when I'm giving you sort of a ballpark estimate of $200, I'm sort of lowballing people a little bit. I'm hoping that they're pleasantly surprised rather than disappointed. Mm-hmm. And we're still in the process of doing the modeling work to sort of look at the condition that Ohio forests are in from a carbon perspective, how those forests are expected to grow over the next 20 years, and what basically sort of how much economic benefit a carbon program could generate for landowners. So we're these are not easy questions. In fact, thank God I'm not doing this work. We've outsourced this to a professional down in North Carolina who has this kind of expertise. So that $200 is a ballpark. I'm hoping it comes in a bit higher than that. But in terms of the payments, we have a payment structure where 20%, that is not per year, that is a total amount that's going to be paid over a 20-year period. There's a 20% payment up front. There is a 30% payment in the final year at the completion of the contract. And then there are payments every year that are sort of on the ballpark of 3, 4, 5, 6% in years 2 through 19 to sort of get you to that 100% payment. One of the conversations that we've been having as a program is if carbon prices do increase, or if we're able to command a higher price for carbon in the future, we want to make sure that our program is equitable and that we're able to engage in this type of profit sharing with landowners. As our contract is written right now, we don't have language in there to that effect. But that is something I'm certainly pushing for, because again, if carbon markets really end up being a significant part of a climate solution, landowners should be justly compensated for that. And if if prices really were to double or triple, it would be, in my mind, fundamentally unfair to not send some of that money back to the people who are managing their forests for that benefit. So that's sort of one piece we're working on. In Ohio, we're also looking at possibly, other ways where we might be able to increase that payment if there, if a landowner would be agree to have their land certified through tree farm or move into a working forest easement. These are discussions I'm having with my boss, and I'm trying to find sources of revenue that we can send out to landowners for being good stewards.
Good deal. Laura asks, how do you determine the highest quality trees you want to retain?
Yeah. Okay. So
how do you answer that one, Tom?
Oh, can I call a friend? Can I get a lifeline here?
Sure.
So yeah, so highest quality is really going to, I know looking at a forest through a forester's lens, there's very much a sense of what a high quality tree is. It's going to be a tree with a relatively low taper, relatively little branching until that tree gets up towards the canopy. Ideally, it's a tree that's well suited for a particular site. So if you're on a south facing ridge, it's not a red maple, it's a nice oak tree. And one that's well formed, that doesn't have forks. But my professional training is as a forest ecologist. So that part of my brain also kicks in. So I'm looking at trees that are going to be good for wildlife, or really shaggy shagbark hickory is going to be great for bats. So for me, that's a high quality tree. And for a landowner, you might have a favorite tree. When you're walking through the forest and come across those big old giants that are over a century old, that were there back when that was a grassland, and that was the one tree. A forester might look at that tree and say, "Oh, that's a wolf tree, that has to come down." But for a landowner, no, that's the best tree on the whole property. That's for me, that's a high quality tree, and we're going to keep that one.
It's an emotional tree.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm one of the people that keeps those trees.
I do too.
So high quality tree is really sort of what you and your forestry professionals sort of agree on is going to be high quality. And you're not always going to see eye to eye for various reasons. But high quality is high quality that you can both agree on.
So it's relative.
I think we can all agree on low quality trees, but high quality is a little bit different.
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean, you start talking about taper and all that, and that's the forester brain in me. But if I got a landowner whose timber is not at the top of their goals, I'm not as interested in that. I'm looking at trees from a different aspect. So if I'm working with someone with a sugar bush, I'm looking for large crowns, not necessarily tall, straight, tapered trees. So Jill asks, are you able to participate in the forest carbon program if you are in ODNR's Ohio Forest Tax Law program?
Yes. I will say that without equivocation. I've had several meetings with the leadership at ODNR Forestry. I think they're pretty excited about this program, and the fact that this is compatible with forest tax law is a real selling point.
Good. So Phil Marshall asks, will you include CRP plantations of mixed hardwoods? Those plantations are approaching 40 to 50 years in youth saw timber size.
Ooh, that's, I don't have a good answer. I'd have to sort of bump back to the folks that developed the actual standards. Mm-hmm. I do know that that those standards were written with an eye to conifer plantations. A mixed hardwood plantation definitely falls into a gray area, and I don't have a good answer for that. If you were to email me again at tom.rooney@tnc.org, I can try to find an answer for you, because I suspect you're not the only one who's going to ask that question, and I need to know the answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, we planted when CRP started. There were a lot of plantings done, and so he's right, those plantings are reaching an age of small saw timber, needing thinned and some other things. So that's a great question. Jeffrey asks, are there any programs for properties less than 30 acres?
So properties less than 30 acres, first and foremost, if you're at least 10 acres, I would strongly encourage you to connect with Tree Farm. That's an opportunity to ensure sustainable management on your property, but that's not a forest carbon program. NCX has no minimum. I think they will go as low as 1 acre. But I believe that they are currently in a pause right now with new carbon offerings. So I think really we're looking at 30 to 40 acres as sort of being a minimum at this time. Again, if carbon markets continue to develop the way I think they are, I expect there to be new entrants, new carbon project developers sort of coming into this space in the future. So if you have, if you don't want to do NCX or can't do NCX, but do want to do carbon and don't have enough acreage, give it a few years. There might be programs that come online in the next few years that are going to be tailored to your property.
Okay. Eddie asks, what are some examples of funding incentives in the Family Forest Carbon Program?
So the main incentive is the payment to landowners that can be used for paying taxes for timber stand improvement or for other things. Our forester can also help connect you with other incentive programs like EQIP that can sort of help facilitate improving your forest condition as well. So, I think that the main value beyond the payments is getting connected with a professional who's going to be, a go-to person with a network of potential providers for what you need.
Anonymous asks, are state agencies eligible for any of these carbon credit programs?
So the answer is yes, with an asterisk. Let's see. So the 4 programs I mentioned today, our program at Nature Conservancy and the other 3 programs are not going to be for state agencies. However, there are other carbon project developers out there that work on larger projects, sort of the 5,000 acre and up, where they start getting those economies of scale. So typically, owners with significant property like that are able to work with those larger carbon project developers. So there are options out there. I know, for example, in Michigan, they recently had a relatively large carbon sale on their state forest lands. Some Wisconsin county forest lands have also been involved in carbon markets, but not in any of the programs I've mentioned today, which are more geared towards individual landowners.
Eddie asks, if my land is already under a conservation easement, can I still join the Family Forest Program?
If it is under a working forest easement, yes. But if it is under a no harvest easement, the answer is no.
Okay. Gary asks, what if there's a conflict between a plan for property under CAUV and the carbon plan, i.e. CAUV plan requires a harvest?
Ultimately, that would depend on the specifics. So I think in some cases you could, our program, at least at the Nature Conservancy, does allow for some harvest. The question is, does your CAUV plan require a harvest more extensive than is permitted under our program? If that is the case, then no, you cannot enroll in our program. Depending on how much property you do have, you might look at the core carbon offering when that becomes available, because you might be able to enroll part of your land in core carbon and still be able to harvest the other part of your land under CAUV.
Thomas asks, why can't a landowner try other programs once a contract is appropriately complete?
That is a great question, and we're going to go into the weeds right now. So one of the features of forest carbon programs and other programs as well is that in order to generate a carbon credit and be able to sell carbon, you need to demonstrate something called additionality. Now, what additionality means is that in the absence of this particular program or being enrolled in this program, that carbon would not have been generated. So that's the short version. If you're a landowner and have engaged in a carbon market previously, you've indicated an intention to store additional carbon, even if it's just for 1 year through NCX. And so you're a landowner who can no longer generate additionality to the satisfaction of the various folks that generate the rules around forest carbon projects. So at least for Family Forest Carbon Program, if you've been enrolled in NCX, you cannot enroll in our project because you're all, from our perspective, at least the way the rules are written, you are already someone who engages in forest carbon storage. And so we can't demonstrate any additionality with your property. I know that that's unsatisfying and perhaps a little bit unfair, but neither the Nature Conservancy nor the American Forest Foundation writes those rules. In order to have our program certified, we go to a third party that writes those rules with public input. So you might be able to do a different forest carbon program with different sets of rules, but you wouldn't be able to do the Family Forest Carbon Program.
Okay. Sandy asks, what happens if you die or need to move before 20 years?
Yeah, again, that's for a carbon project in general, it's going to depend on the specifics of your contract. With the Family Forest Carbon Program, there are a couple options. One of which is you can exit the program and return, basically cover the costs of the program in terms of payments and that you received and payments that the forester received from us back to us, and exit the program that way. And we would, of course, need to go back and also cover, basically reverse that carbon that we had gotten out of the market. So we'd have to cover those carbon costs as well. That's one option. Another option is the Family Forest Carbon Program can transfer to the next owner, whether it's an heir or an encumbrance on the property. So the new owner can come in and basically take over receiving those payments where you had left off. So those are sort of the two main options. We would certainly encourage the second rather than the first.
Okay. So John asks, your best guess about when the Family Forest Carbon Program will be available statewide?
Yes. Okay. My best guess is not it's a little bit more pessimistic than most of the other people working in the space. I would say probably by 2025. Right now, the program, which was developed by American Forest Foundation, was rolled out initially in Pennsylvania. They learned there and then rolled it out to West Virginia and Western Maryland, learned a little bit more. They've rolled it out to now to northeastern US and to the upper Great Lakes states, so Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota. They're learning a little bit more. So they're basically sort of refining the project as they go. We're rolling out in 2023 in the Appalachian Plateaus region, more or less using the same protocols that they have in place for West Virginia. So sort of piggybacking on something existing that doesn't need to be built from scratch. However, for the western half of the state in the Till Plains, that program would really need to be built from scratch. It would be similar to, I'd imagine we'd build that for Eastern Ohio, Southern Michigan, Western Ohio, Southern Michigan, Indiana, and much of Illinois. And that's going to take some additional time. I think 2025 at the earliest, maybe a little bit later. I know right now, American Forest Foundation is hiring like crazy, trying to get this program rolled out by 2024 nationwide. I hope they can get there. I think it's just going to take them a little bit longer than they're hoping. So it's on the way, but it is going nationwide. It should be available in the rest of the states. American Forest Foundation would say 2024. I would say 2025. Neither of us are saying 2030.
Okay. Lori asks, under a carbon contract, is selective timbering still permitted, i.e. harvesting older trees for dimensional lumber to allow for new growth in a healthier forest?
Yeah, so that would still be permitted as long as the basal area of the stand is not decreasing. So for example, you wouldn't be able to go in and do a thinning from above. You wouldn't be able to initiate a shelterwood harvest. But if you were removing, 2 or 3 high quality trees per acre, that would certainly be permitted. Again, we want to make sure that the overall basal area of the stand is not declining by 25% or more over the course of the 20-year contract. And we want to make sure that the basal area is not declining by 10% or more. So and a good forester can work within those parameters, so that you can harvest some of those higher quality trees, using a selection logging system, and still maintain, excellent growth elsewhere in your forests and still generate revenue for those really high quality trees.
Okay. Brad asks, related to the urban forestry question, has there been much study of the effect on carbon from converting suburban landscape, such as grass, to some level of forest, similar to Douglas Ptolemy's investigation of the effect of planting natives for wildlife support?
That's another great question. And I don't think that has been examined explicitly. I think that's sort of an open question, but I do think there certainly is a place for urban forests, sort of in all their infinite varieties, as being part of this carbon solution. In fact, there is a carbon project developer I didn't mention by name because they're still relatively small. It's a nonprofit based out of Seattle that just does urban forest projects. Typically, it's not going to be in suburban areas. It's going to be in those little pocket preserves that you might have in urban areas. They're doing carbon projects on those smaller tracts of land, and I believe they are active in Ohio, up in the northeastern part of the state, and have worked with I'm blanking on the name of the conservancy up there, the Western Preserve lands up in and around the Cleveland area.
Oh, yeah.
Western Lands Conservancy.
There you go.
And I think it's called City Forests. But if you were to Google City Forests and Carbon Project, I think you'd find them pretty quickly.
Okay. Laura asked, does the management to improve forest health include the removal of invasives?
Yes.
Right answer, Tom. Right answer. It's what we're all spending all of our time on, right?
Absolutely.
So let's see, we kind of answered that one. In the chat, someone stated Rogers and Columbiana County are not eligible. Is there a list of other counties that are not eligible?
We are still in the process of getting that final list of counties that are eligible, but essentially, my understanding is that the counties that are going to be in that Appalachian Plateau, Appalachian Escarpment region are going to be eligible for inclusion. So effectively the eastern half of the state and the southern part of the state over towards Adams County.
Okay. So Lori asks, if I have sold my subsurface rights, such as hydrocarbon interests, but maintained my surface land interests, which owner, surface or subsurface, holds the carbon rights and ability to sell them?
The surface owner would own those carbon rights. Okay, because your subsurface owner is that they don't really own the roots of your trees or the soil, they own the minerals. Right.
Okay. So Gary asks, may have missed this, but do municipal owned forest lands qualify?
For the Family Forest Carbon Program, no, but for other carbon programs, potentially yes. I think for municipal owned lands, the Forest Carbon Works program might be worth looking at. It's one of those programs with a 100-year commitment, but being that it's not an individual landowner, it is a municipal landowner. I think there might be some good opportunities there in that program. I know for just to mention, for our program, it's really just for family forest owners or for families that have LLCs for their property. We're not doing municipal lands, public lands, or industrial lands.
I always kind of think about that because I do a lot of work on the OSU Mansfield campus, and we have 600 acres of woods. So it's like
Forest Carbon Works.
Yeah.
Forest Carbon Works.
We need to think about that, don't we? And we do have other OSU properties that have large acres, but I think the Mansfield chunk is one of the biggest that we have in the system. So, so we did have, Frank was kind of talking about, the carbon program. He's heard a lot of talks. Contracts seem too long, seems a little, wonky. Why are we not concentrating on one of the largest non-productive ecosystems around, which is our lawns? Is there anything that you've seen? I haven't seen anything that talks about lawns and the whole carbon program.
No, so the forest carbon markets are sort of new and wonky enough. There are also soil carbon markets for agricultural systems, which are even wonkier and newer, and the carbon's harder to measure, and the contracts are weirder. I love the question and thinking about lawns and putting replacing grass with native perennials and habitat structure for bees and beetles and what have you. But no, there's no carbon market available for that at this time. However, I think there are folks right now that are looking at carbon markets and thinking to themselves, perhaps there might be opportunities for biodiversity markets and securing payments for people who are providing native habitat. I think that's still a ways off, but I know those conversations are underway. Assuming that as biodiversity continues to be under pressure and continues to decline, is there going to be a willingness on the part of individuals or on the part of corporate citizens exercising corporate responsibility, doing their part to help preserve biodiversity? Those are very, very recent conversations, but they are happening.
Okay. One last one we have just popped in. Andrew asks, what about lands that are owned by a land trust organization? Can they enroll in the FFCP provided there are no timber restrictions in their easement?
So for FFCP, they can't, again, because our program is specifically designed for family forest owners. Again, I think for a land trust, looking at another carbon provider like Forest Carbon Works, given that the land trusts are holding those properties for the long term, that might be an opportunity to work with another forest carbon project developer. I love the question, and I'm happy, despite the fact I'm supposed to talk my own book, I'm happy to sort of help people align with a program that's better suited for them. Because at the end of the day, I'd like to see, more forests going into forest carbon programs. In the broad sense, many of them I hope will come with us in the family forest carbon program, but I know we're not right for everybody. And our rules are going to be, not allow everybody in. But the broader concept, I think, is an exciting one. One I think is relatively easy for a lot of landowners to participate in. And I think the idea of rewarding people for being good stewards is I just love that.
Okay. Well, that's all of our questions. Marnie, you want to stop recording?